There was a moment, back in the late 1990s, when Lauryn Hill was arguably the biggest artist on the planet. She was the face on every magazine cover, the voice on every radio station, the name every critic used when they wanted to describe genius. And then, almost as quickly as she arrived, she pulled back. No steady stream of albums, no constant media cycle, no chasing the next hit. For nearly 3 decades now, fans have been asking the same question in different ways. What actually happened to Lauryn Hill? And why did one of the most gifted musicians of her generation choose to walk away from the very industry that made her a household name? The answer isn't a single event. It's a long, layered story of extraordinary success, legal battles, personal reinvention, and a woman who decided more than once that her peace of mind mattered more than her place on the charts. To understand why she left, you first have to understand how high she flew. Lauryn Noel Hill was born on May 26, 1975, in East Orange, New Jersey, to Valerie Hill, an English teacher, and Mal Hill, a computer consultant. The family eventually settled in South Orange, a town just next door, where music was simply part of the household air. Her mother played piano, her father sang, and her older brother Mulaney picked up instruments of his own. Hill has said that there was almost always music playing somewhere in that house. And it's not hard to see how that environment shaped a kid who would later blend soul, reggae, and hip-hop into something entirely her own. She attended Columbia High School in Maplewood, where she was a cheerleader, ran track, and founded the school's gospel choir, all while chasing an early acting career that put her on the soap opera As the World Turns, and famously, in Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit. At 13, she'd already stood on the stage at the Apollo Theater's amateur night, nervous and visibly shaking, only to push through a rendition of a Smokey Robinson song and win the crowd over anyway. That moment, arguably, tells you everything about the artist she would become, someone who felt fear and performed through it. It was at Columbia High School that Hill crossed paths with Prakazrel Praz Michel, and soon after, his cousin Wyclef Jean. What started as a group called Translator Crew evolved into the Fugees, a trio that fused hip-hop with reggae and soul in a way nobody else was doing at the time. Their 1994 debut, Blunted on Reality, barely made a dent commercially, and plenty of people assumed that would be the end of the story. Instead, 2 years later, the group released The Score, an album that changed everything. Built around singles like Ready or Not and their cover of Killing Me Softly, the record shot to the top of the Billboard 200, sold millions of copies worldwide, and won the Fugees a pair of Grammy Awards. Hill's voice, in particular, became the group's signature, soulful and commanding in a genre that hadn't always made space for a woman to lead. But success has a way of exposing cracks that were already there. Behind the scenes, tensions were building. Wyclef Jean was increasingly focused on his own solo ambitions, and there were reports that he wasn't especially supportive when Hill began developing music of her own. Complicating things further, Hill and Jean had been romantically involved, which meant the group's professional friction was tangled up with personal history. By 1997, just a year after The Score made them global stars, the Fugees quietly fell apart. For Hill, though, the breakup didn't end her career, it launched the next, far more personal chapter of it. In August 1998, she released The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, her first and only solo studio album, and it remains one of the defining records in modern music. It debuted at number 1, sold over 400,000 copies in its first week, a record at the time for a female artist, and eventually earned a diamond certification from the Recording Industry Association of America. At the 1999 Grammy Awards, Hill won 5 awards in a single night, including Album of the Year, making her the first hip-hop artist ever to take that top prize. The album explored heartbreak, motherhood, faith, and black identity with a rawness that felt like nothing else on the radio, and critics still routinely rank it among the greatest albums ever made, in any genre. She'd also just become a mother, having given birth to her first child with Rohan Marley, the son of reggae legend Bob Marley, and much of the record's emotional weight came directly from that experience of becoming a parent while the world demanded she keep performing. By any measure, Hill was on top of the world, and that's exactly when the first serious crack appeared. Just months after the album's release, in November 1998, a group of musicians and producers who called themselves New Ark filed a lawsuit against Hill, her management, and Columbia Records. The suit, which reportedly ran 50 pages, argued that New Ark's members, Veda Nobles, Rasheem Pugh, and the songwriting siblings to Jumold and Johari Newton, had played a substantial, uncredited role in writing, arranging, and producing 13 of the album's 14 tracks, despite the liner notes crediting the work almost entirely to Hill. New Ark wanted both recognition and a share of the album's enormous earnings. The case dragged on for more than 2 years, through depositions and public sparring, with Hill's camp insisting the claims were without merit, while people who'd worked in the studio offered mixed accounts of how collaborative the sessions really were. In February 2001, Hill settled out of court, reportedly paying New Ark around $5 million. The settlement closed the legal chapter, but it left something behind that money couldn't fully resolve. A public argument over how much of Miseducation was truly hers, and a private wound for an artist who had poured herself into that record as an act of personal truth-telling. That lawsuit is widely seen as the beginning of Hill's retreat. Friends and collaborators who watched her during that period described someone who had grown noticeably more guarded, more suspicious of the people around her, and increasingly uncomfortable with the machinery of the industry that had made her famous. It was around this time that she formed a close relationship with a man known as Brother Anthony, a spiritual figure who became a significant presence in her life and, according to those close to her, in her decision-making. Accounts of his influence vary wildly. Some who knew Hill described the relationship in deeply unflattering terms, suggesting his hold over her was controlling. Others framed it more simply, as Hill turning toward faith and spiritual guidance at a moment when she felt betrayed by an industry built on contracts, credit, and money. Whatever the full truth of that relationship, it coincided with a clear shift in Hill's priorities, away from chart positions and toward something she described as a search for authenticity. In 2001, she resurfaced with MTV Unplugged No. 2.0, a live album recorded with just her voice and an acoustic guitar, stripped of the polished production that defined Miseducation. It was raw almost to the point of discomfort, filled with spoken interludes where she reflected openly on burnout, motherhood, and her disillusionment with fame. Reactions were split. Some listeners found it to be one of the most honest records of her career, an unfiltered look at an artist working through real pain in real time. Others were confused, expecting another polished, radio-ready follow-up to her debut, and getting something closer to a diary set to music. Either way, it was the last full album she would release. In the years that followed, Columbia Records reportedly invested heavily in developing a proper sophomore studio album, even bringing in collaborators who ended up waiting in hotel rooms for sessions that kept getting pushed back. The follow-up never materialized, and the label eventually pulled its support. For an artist whose debut had reshaped what a hip-hop album could sound like, the absence of a second one became one of music's most talked about what-ifs. Money problems compounded the personal ones. In June 2012, Hill pleaded guilty to 3 counts of tax evasion for failing to file federal returns on roughly $1.8 million in income earned between 2005 and 2007, with prosecutors later noting the unreported income across a broader window topped $2.3 million. In court, Hill explained that during those years, she had deliberately withdrawn from the commercial side of the music business, disillusioned by what she felt it had done to her art and her sense of self, and that withdrawal bled into every part of her life, including her finances. In April 2013, a judge sentenced her to 3 months in federal prison, followed by 3 months of home confinement, along with a substantial fine. She began serving her sentence that July at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, and was released in October of that year. She has spoken since about how disorienting that period was, framing it less as a scandal and more as an unavoidable reckoning with just how far she had drifted from managing her own affairs while trying to protect her inner life from an industry she no longer trusted. Health struggles added another layer. During a European tour, Hill reportedly passed out on stage and had to cancel the remaining dates, a moment that fueled ongoing speculation about the physical and emotional toll of touring on an artist who had already made clear she was uneasy with the demands of fame. around the same period. She closed the doors on her original nonprofit organization and, according to reports at the time, converted part of her living space into a home recording studio, choices that struck some inner circle as further evidence that she was retreating from the industry's traditional structures altogether and trying to build music and a life entirely on her own terms. Either. Over the years, she became known, fairly or not, for arriving late to her own concerts, sometimes by well over an hour, and for shows that fans described as inconsistent. That reputation turned into a running joke on social media, with clips of tardy start times circulating alongside commentary, calling her difficult or out of touch with the audience that had stayed loyal to her for decades. Hill addressed the criticism directly in a lengthy 2016 Facebook post, explaining that her lateness wasn't a sign of indifference toward her fans, but the opposite. She said she needed to feel emotionally aligned, rested, and genuinely free before she could give an honest performance, and that rushing onto a stage before she reached that state would be a disservice to the people who'd paid to see her. Whether or not that explanation satisfied critics, it offered a rare, direct window into how deliberately she now approaches every appearance, treating performance less as a job to clock into and more as something that has to be earned internally first. Her family life brought its own layer of public scrutiny. Her daughter, Selah Marley, spoke publicly about experiencing physical discipline as a child, while also saying she didn't want people using her words to attack her mother. Hill responded by defending the discipline as culturally rooted rather than abusive, while acknowledging in her own words that if she was guilty of anything, it was disciplining out of frustration rather than a lack of love. It was a messy, human moment that reminded fans Hill's story isn't only about record sales and lawsuits. It's also about a mother trying to raise 6 children largely outside the spotlight, while carrying the weight of being permanently defined by one album from 1998. More recently, the drama hasn't fully faded. In 2023, Hill reunited with Wyclef Jean and Pras Michel for a 25th anniversary Fugees tour, giving longtime fans a nostalgic glimpse of the chemistry that made the score a phenomenon in the first place, even as several dates were canceled along the way. That reunion, though, later spilled into new legal conflict. In 2024, Pras Michel filed a lawsuit against Hill alleging financial mismanagement of the group's business affairs and claiming she had blocked a lucrative festival offer for the trio. Hill publicly rejected the claims as baseless and pointed out that Michel had, in her account, been advanced money he hadn't repaid. It was a stark reminder that even the group's most celebratory moments still carry the same old tensions that broke them apart nearly 3 decades earlier. Through all of it, Hill has continued showing up for causes that matter to her, even when she stayed away from the recording studio. In 1996, she founded a nonprofit originally known as the Refugee Project, aimed at giving underserved young people access to education, mentorship, and the arts. She's spoken out on prison reform and mass incarceration, released the protest track Black Rage in the wake of Michael Brown's killing in 2014, and during a 2003 performance in Vatican City, used the stage to directly criticize the Catholic Church over the sexual abuse of children by clergy, a moment that drew sharp backlash from church officials, but also pushed a difficult conversation into the open years before it became a mainstream reckoning. In 1999, the NAACP recognized her humanitarian work with a President's Award, cementing a side of her legacy that exists entirely separate from chart positions and award shows. It's worth pausing on just how singular the miseducation of Lauryn Hill was in the context of the industry Hill was trying to escape. Released on Rough House and Columbia Records in August 1998, it arrived at a moment when hip-hop and R&B were still largely treated as separate commercial lanes, and when a solo album from a woman who had just left one of the era's biggest groups was expected, by industry logic, to underperform. Instead, miseducation became a cultural event. Tracks like Doo Wop That Thing and X Factor married old-school soul instrumentation with unapologetically direct lyrics about self-respect, betrayal, and womanhood, while To Zion turned the pressure she'd faced to terminate her pregnancy for the sake of her career into one of the most tender songs about motherhood ever put on a hip-hop record. In February 1999, She became the first hip-hop artist to appear on the cover of Time magazine, a milestone that, at the time, was treated as proof the genre had finally been accepted into the cultural mainstream. It's a strange irony that the very album that opened that door for hip-hop also became the source of the legal fight that pushed Hill to eventually close it behind her. That contradiction, adored by the world for a record she came to feel conflicted about, sits at the center of understanding her withdrawal. In interviews given years later, Hill has repeatedly returned to the idea that the version of herself the public fell in love with in 1998 was, in some ways, a performance of togetherness that didn't match what she was actually experiencing behind the scenes. She's described feeling pressure to keep producing at the same level, to keep smiling through award shows and magazine shoots, while privately negotiating a lawsuit over the authorship of the very songs being celebrated. For an artist whose entire appeal was built on radical honesty, that gap between the public image and the private reality became, by her own account, unsustainable. Stepping back wasn't simply about avoiding the industry's demands. It was about refusing to keep performing a version of stability she no longer felt.